For 55 years, four children grew up believing their father had looked at them and chosen to walk away. Jean was 6 years old. Patricia was 4. Stephen was 2. And Michael had been alive for exactly 8 months on the night his father put on his jacket, told his wife he was going out for cigarettes, and never came back. For 55 years they carried that, not as a memory they could examine and set down when it became too heavy, but as a foundational fact about themselves. The specific, identity-shaping, life-altering belief that they were the children whose father decided they were not worth the staying. And then, on a Halloween evening in 2018, in the basement of the house where it all began, a shovel struck something in the earth 4 feet below the concrete floor. And the truth that one woman had kept buried for longer than any of her children had been alive finally, at last, came up. George Mitchell had never left his family. He had been right there the entire time. His name was George Raymond Mitchell. He was 30 years old, a Korean War veteran, a truck driver, a father of 4. He was the kind of man who shoveled his neighbor's walk without being asked and returned what he borrowed and showed up when he said he would. He had survived a war his country preferred not to remember. He had come home and built a life, quietly and without complaint, the way men of his generation and his background built lives, one working day at a time. And on a Tuesday evening in 1963, he walked down the front path of his house on Olive Street in Lake Grove, Long Island, waved back at his 6-year-old daughter Jean, who had run to the door to see him off, turned right toward the corner store, and was murdered. His children spent 55 years believing he had abandoned them. The truth was 4 feet beneath the floor they walked on every day. This is their story, and it will change the way you think about the things families bury. Before we go inside what happened on Olive Street, and in the 55 years that followed, 3 questions are going to guide everything we examine in this story. The first, what actually happened to George Raymond Mitchell on that Tuesday evening in 1963? Not the version Dorothy Mitchell told her children the following morning. Not the story the neighborhood accepted because it was the only version being offered. The truth that a forensic examination 55 years later would reduce to a set of clinical findings that tell, in the language of bone and fracture, everything that was done to one man in a basement in Long Island in the fall of 1963. The second, what did Dorothy Mitchell know? And how does a woman live with that knowledge for 35 years while her children grow up asking, in their various quiet and heartbroken ways, what it was about them that was not enough to make him stay? And the third question, the one that has stayed with me the longest and that I believe is the real heart of everything the Mitchell family has lived through, is this. What happens to the wound? The specific, identity-altering wound of growing up believing your father abandoned you, when the truth turns out to be that he never left at all. Does knowing the truth fix it? Does it reach back across 55 years and undo the damage that was done? Or does it leave something behind that the truth alone, however welcome and however long overdue, cannot fully reach? We are going to answer all 3 of those questions today. But the last one, I have to warn you, does not have a clean or simple answer. And it is the one that matters most. Before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. George Raymond Mitchell was born in 1933 in Queens, New York, the second of 3 children, the son of a postal worker, raised in the specific dignity of a working-class household that understood the difference between what you had and what you were. He was drafted into the United States Army in 1952, at the age of 19, and served in the Korean War during its final brutal months. Korea was the war between the wars, fought with real blood on real ground, and forgotten with remarkable speed by the country that sent its men to die in it. George Mitchell came home from Korea in 1954 with an honorable discharge and the particular adjustment that war requires of a man who has seen things he is expected to manage quietly. He adjusted. He found work driving a truck. He met Dorothy and Reeves at a church social in 1955, married her the following year, and by 1963 he had 4 children under 7, a mortgage on a modest house in Lake Grove, and a life that looked exactly what it was supposed to look like. His neighbor Harold, who had lived on Olive Street since before the Mitchells moved in, spoke to a local journalist decades after George's disappearance and recounted a conversation he had with George approximately 1 week before he vanished. They had been standing on the sidewalk on an ordinary afternoon, talking about nothing in particular, when George had said, quietly, without preamble, the way a man says something he has been carrying for a long time and has finally allowed a piece of it out. "Harold, some things are not what you think they are until they are already past fixing." Harold had laughed and said something vague about marriage in general. George had nodded and gone inside. Harold never saw him again. He said he had thought about that sentence every single day for the rest of his life. Not because it was mysterious or dramatic, but because of what it sounded like in retrospect. It sounded like a man who already knew he was out of time. Dorothy Mitchell was 29 years old in 1963. She was capable, organized, managing in the way of a woman who had been raised to regard competence as the most reliable form of love. She ran her household with efficiency and raised her children with consistency and presented to the world the specific, controlled exterior of a person who has organized everything within their reach and left very little space for the unorganized. In 1962, a year before George's disappearance, she and George had hired a young handyman named Richard Daines to help with a construction project at the house. Richard was in his mid-20s, younger than George, unmarried, and the kind of man who moved from place to place without accumulating the particular anchors that tend to hold a person in one location. He was supposed to be at Olive Street for a few weeks. He was still there when George died. The Mitchell siblings, looking back at that year from the vantage point of adults who now understood what they had not understood as children, described his presence in their household in those final months with a consistency that was itself one of the most significant facts in the Mitchell case. He was there more than the work required. He was too comfortable in a space that still belonged to someone else. On a Tuesday evening in the fall of 1963, George Mitchell came in from the backyard, sat at the kitchen table, drank a glass of water, and told Dorothy he was going out for cigarettes. He had said this hundreds of times before. It was not a notable sentence. It was the ordinary sentence of a man with an ordinary habit on an ordinary Tuesday evening. He stood up. He put on his brown work jacket, the one Jean would later say she could still remember the smell of, decades after the last time she saw it. He moved toward the front door. Jean, who was 6 and who had the specific attentiveness of a child who has learned to read the emotional weather of a household, ran to the front door to wave at him. He looked at her. He waved back. He walked down the concrete path to the sidewalk, reached the corner, and turned right toward the direction of the store. And that was the last time any of his children saw their father alive. What happened between the moment George turned right on the sidewalk and the moment someone buried him beneath the basement floor of his own house is something the historical record cannot reconstruct with certainty, because the only people who knew the full answer to that question are dead. What the forensic examination of George Mitchell's remains established 55 years later is a set of facts that leave very little interpretive space. His skull showed clear and unambiguous evidence of blunt force trauma. His death was classified as a homicide by the medical examiner. He had been buried deliberately, in a manner that required both physical access to the property and knowledge of the specific layout of the basement. He was wrapped in clothing and placed 4 feet beneath the concrete floor of the house, where his children would eat and sleep and grow up, and ask what was wrong with them that their father had left. The events of that Tuesday evening ended with George Mitchell dead and the truth underground. And the woman who went to bed that night proceeded, the following morning, to begin the construction of a story she would maintain for the next 35 years. Dorothy told the children the morning after George's disappearance that their father had left. Not that something had happened to him. Not that she was worried and they were going to figure out where he had gone. That he had left. That he had made a choice. That he was not coming back and that this was the way things were going to be from now on. Jean asked where he had gone. Dorothy said she did not know. Patricia asked if he was coming back. Dorothy said no. Stephen, who was 2, understood almost nothing of the specific words, but understood from the quality of the morning, the flatness of his mother's voice, the stillness in the house, the specific absence of something that had been there the day before, that the world had changed in a way that was not going to change back. Michael, who was 8 months old, understood nothing. He simply continued being 8 months old in a house where his father had been dead since the night before, 4 feet beneath the floor. No missing person report was ever filed. Not that day. Not that week. Not ever. The door on this subject was closed before any outside hand could reach it. No investigation was opened because no investigation was requested. Dorothy's version of events, George left, he chose to go, there is nothing to investigate. Was accepted because it was the only version available and because Dorothy delivered it with the flat, finished certainty of someone who had already decided that no further examination was going to be tolerated. The neighbors noticed his absence. Extended family asked questions. The people who had known George had doubts about the version they were being given, doubts that some of them carried for the rest of their lives. But doubts without an investigation are just rumors. And rumors, in the specific social climate of a working-class neighborhood in Long Island in 1963, where a woman had stated plainly that her husband had simply walked away and where the alternative was too enormous to press without evidence, went nowhere. Dorothy had built the story to withstand exactly this kind of pressure, and it withstood it for 35 years, until she died, and for 20 years after that. Within a remarkably short time after George's disappearance, Dorothy and Richard Danes formalized what had apparently been in formation for some time before George walked down the front path. Richard did not leave the house on Olive Street. He did not return to the orbit of Handyman and move on to the next job. He stayed. He and Dorothy became a couple with the specific speed of people whose relationship was not as new as its public timeline suggested. They would later have a son together, a boy they named Richard Jr., a child who grew up in the same house as the Mitchell children, who was the half-sibling of Jean and Patricia and Stephen and Michael, and who was placed, by the circumstances of his birth and his parents' history, in a position the documentary filmmaker Patricia described as extraordinarily difficult. Richard Jr. was not responsible for what his father had done or what his mother had hidden, but he grew up inside the same house and the same silence, shaped by the same buried truth, in a way that nobody who has examined this case can entirely account for. The years Richard Danes spent in the Mitchell household are the darkest part of a story that is already dark. The Mitchell siblings have been consistent and specific in their allegations about what Richard did to them during the years he was present in their home. They alleged physical abuse. Jean and Patricia alleged sexual abuse. These are not peripheral details. They are the account of what 4 children experienced in the house above their father's grave. A house where the man who, by the direction of every available piece of evidence, was responsible for putting George Mitchell in that grave was simultaneously the man who came home every evening and whose behavior toward the children Dorothy insisted they accept. Dorothy Mitchell divorced Richard Danes in 1983. The Mitchell children have said, in the years since the discovery, that their feelings about their mother are complicated, that they loved her, that they still love her, that they have spent years trying to understand a woman who protected a secret and did not protect her children, and who took both the secret and the reasons for it to her grave in 1998 without ever giving them either. Jean Mitchell was 6 when her father walked down the front path and turned right and never came back. 6 is old enough to have real specific memories of a father. The sound of his voice, the particular way he moved through the house, the feeling of being waved at from the front door. And 6 is old enough to understand, when you are told the following morning that your father chose to leave, that the choosing was personal, that it was, at some level that a 6-year-old cannot articulate but absolutely absorbs, a statement about your value, about whether you were enough to make him stay. Jean carried this for 62 years. She carried it into every relationship she ever had, testing it against every person who said they loved her, waiting for them to confirm, as her father had confirmed, that love was a condition with an expiration date. Patricia, who was 4, had fewer concrete memories but absorbed the story in the way very young children absorb foundational truths, not as something learned, but as something simply known, the way you know which direction is down. Stephen was 2. He had almost no memories of his father and processed his father's absence the way toddlers process loss, not as a specific event, but as a shift in the architecture of the world around him, a space where a person was supposed to be and was not, a shape that should have been filled and was not. He told the documentary filmmaker, "Our father was in the ground for 55 years while we just thought he abandoned us. But somebody murdered him." That sentence, "Our father was in the ground for 55 years while we just thought he abandoned us," is one of the most concise and devastating articulations of what the lie did to the Mitchell family that I have encountered in the course of preparing this story. And Michael, who had been 8 months old, who had no memories of his father whatsoever, who had grown up with nothing but the awareness of the shape where a father was supposed to be, Michael bought the house on Olive Street from his mother Dorothy in 1993. He was 30 years old. His father had been dead for 30 years, though Michael did not know this. And he bought the house anyway. Michael has been asked about the decision to buy his childhood home many times in the years since the discovery, and his answers have always circled the same territory without settling on a single clean explanation. He felt connected to the house. He felt, without knowing why or how, that the answer to the question he had been asking his entire life was somewhere in or around that property. He raised his sons Christopher and Mike Jr. in the house on Olive Street. He renovated it over the years: the kitchen, the bathrooms, the windows, the structural elements that the passing decades required. He did not touch the basement floor. There was no practical reason not to. The basement was functional and finished and showed no obvious signs that anything beneath it needed attention. And yet, every time a renovation brought him near it, some pull he could not explain in any rational language, kept him from going further. In 2010, Jean connected with a psychic. She brought Michael to meet her. Neither of them, by their own account, believed in psychics. But they were the children of a man who had disappeared without a trace, and they had run out of conventional directions to look, and so they went. The psychic told Michael and Jean things about their father's disappearance that she could not have known from any publicly available source. She said their father had never left them. She said he was still there, in the house, in the ground beneath the house. She said, "I am channeling your father, and he is telling me that Richard killed him and buried him in the basement." Michael and Jean looked at each other in the way that two people look at each other when they have just heard something that their rational minds know they should not believe, and that every other part of them already does. They had grown up with Richard Danes in their house. They knew exactly who Richard was. They had carried what Richard had done to them for decades. And now a woman who could not have known any of that history was sitting in front of them, saying his name in connection with their father's death. Michael went home. He did not immediately act. But the statement settled into him the way certain statements settle into a person who has been waiting for an answer their whole life. And over the months that followed, it became a decision. In 2018, Michael Mitchell hired a ground-penetrating radar company to scan the basement floor of the house on Olive Street. He was methodical about this. He was 55 years old. He had been waiting for most of his life for an answer, and he was not going to approach the finding of it carelessly. The radar results gave him something to work with, not a certainty, but a reading of the subsurface beneath a particular section of the basement floor that was consistent with what the psychic had told him 8 years earlier and inconsistent with the ordinary undisturbed earth that a residential basement floor should rest on. Michael got a jackhammer. He went downstairs. He began to break through the concrete. In the late summer of 2018, before the excavation had reached what he was looking for, Michael suffered a stroke. It was not fatal, but it left him unable to manage the basement stairs without help. He called his sons Christopher and Mike Jr. He showed them the radar results. He told them what he had been doing and why, and what he believed was down there, and why he believed it. Christopher and Mike Jr. went into the basement. They picked up their father's tools, and they dug. They dug through September and into October of 2018, going into the basement on their evenings, and their days off, and their weekends, making slow, careful progress through the compacted material beneath the floor that had not been disturbed in 55 years. The neighborhood around them went about its ordinary business. The house on Olive Street looked, from the outside, like a house where ordinary things were happening. On the evening of October 30th, the night before Halloween, while the street was beginning to take on the particular festive atmosphere of the holiday, while neighbors set out decorations and children planned costumes, Christopher Mitchell's shovel struck something in the earth approximately 6 feet beneath the surface of the basement floor. He stopped. He crouched down. He moved the surrounding material carefully with his hands, the way you move something when you already know, at some level that precedes rational thought, that what you are looking at is going to rewrite everything. He stood up. He climbed the stairs. He walked into the living room where his father was sitting, and he said, in the quietest and most careful voice Michael had ever heard from him, "Dad, I think we found something. You need to go downstairs." Michael went downstairs with his son's help. He looked at what Christopher had uncovered in the excavation. The Suffolk County Police Department was called to the house on Olive Street that evening. Forensic investigators arrived. The remains were removed carefully and taken for examination. DNA samples were collected. The Mitchell family waited. Michael Mitchell, who had waited 55 years for an answer to the question of what happened to his father, waited some more. The results came back in the weeks following the discovery. Detective Aaron Briggs of the Suffolk County Homicide Division called Michael with the findings. The DNA analysis confirmed that the skeletal remains found beneath the basement floor of the house on Olive Street belonged to George Raymond Mitchell, Michael's father, Jean's father, Patricia's father, Stephen's father. The man Dorothy had told her children went out for cigarettes in 1963 and chose never to come back, had in fact never gone anywhere at all. He had been there every single day, every birthday, every Christmas, every Tuesday evening, right there beneath their feet. The forensic examination produced a finding that the Mitchell family had moved toward in their understanding without quite allowing themselves to fully arrive at. George Mitchell's skull showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma. His death was classified as a homicide by the Suffolk County Medical Examiner. He had not died accidentally. He had been struck hard enough to fracture his skull, and then he had been buried deliberately beneath the floor of his own home. Detective Briggs described the investigation that followed as one conducted with the full weight of the evidence available and the full awareness of what that evidence could and could not accomplish. Because both Dorothy Mitchell and Richard Daines were dead. Dorothy had died in 1998. Richard Daines died in 2018, the same year Christopher and Mike Jr. made the discovery, too recently to have been questioned under the weight of what the forensic evidence had just made possible to ask. Two people. The two people most likely to know what happened on that Tuesday evening in 1963. Both dead, both beyond the reach of the law that the evidence now demanded. The Suffolk County Police Department listed the Mitchell case as an active homicide investigation. Detective Briggs said, in the careful, measured language of a professional who understands the difference between knowing something and being able to prove it in a court of law, that the investigation continued and that the department was committed to pursuing every available avenue. What this means in practice is that a crime was committed, that the evidence points clearly enough in a direction that the word perpetrators has a specific address in this case, and that no one will ever be arrested for it, tried for it, or convicted of it. George Mitchell was murdered. The people responsible for his murder died in their own beds, in their own time, on their own terms. The law arrived at Olive Street 55 years too late to do anything about what had happened there. This is not a twist in the Mitchell story. It is not a revelation that surprises anyone who has been paying attention. It is simply the fact that sits at the center of everything, heavy and immovable and entirely without resolution. On October 25, 2019, George Raymond Mitchell was interred with full military honors at a national cemetery on Long Island. An honor guard folded the flag with the precision that the ceremony requires and presented it to his family. A bugler played. His 4 children were present, Jean, Patricia, Stephen, and Michael, all 4 of them standing together at a grave that was finally a real grave, with a stone that said his name and his dates and his service and the truth of what he was, a father and a Korean War veteran and a man who had been wronged and who deserved, after 55 years in a basement, to be acknowledged. There are photographs of the Mitchell siblings at that ceremony. What I notice about those photographs is not only the grief on their faces, though the grief is entirely visible and entirely earned. It is the specific quality of how they are standing, upright, together, with the posture of people who have been carrying something for a very long time and have just been told, for the first time, what it actually was. Michael Mitchell said something about standing at his father's grave that has stayed with me since I first heard it. He said, I never knew him. I was 8 months old. I have no memory of his face or his voice or the way it felt to be held by him. Nothing. And I spent my whole life feeling the shape of where he was supposed to be. Not a memory. A shape. Like a space in the architecture of myself that was always supposed to be occupied and never was. And standing at that grave I kept thinking, you were there. All those years I thought you left us, you were right there. Under the house. You never went anywhere. He paused. And then he said, I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I think it makes it both at the same time. And I think that is something I am going to carry for the rest of my life. The same way I carried the other thing for 50 years. Except this time what I am carrying is true. Patricia Mitchell said something in the documentary that is, to my mind, the most complete and the most honest thing anyone in the Mitchell family has said about what the discovery meant and what it could not mean. She said, when I found out the truth, I felt 2 things at the same time. The first was relief. The purest relief I have ever felt. Because he did not leave us. He did not make a choice. He was murdered, and we were told a lie for 55 years, and the lie was wrong from the first word to the last. He did not leave because of us. He did not leave because of me. He was taken from us. And that matters more than I can tell you. That changes something in me that nothing else in 55 years had managed to change. But the second thing she said she felt was grief. For the 50 years, she spent carrying the wrong story. Because the story was a lie. But the carrying of it was real. And nobody was giving those 50 years back to her. The Mitchell children have also said something about their mother that is worth holding carefully before we move into the final part of this story. Despite everything, despite the lie and the 35 years of silence and what Richard Danes did in the house above their father's grave while Dorothy allowed it, despite all of that, the Mitchell siblings remained protective of their mother's memory. They loved her. Jean and Patricia and Stephen and Michael, in their various ways, loved Dorothy Mitchell. They have said this in interviews, and they have said it to the documentary filmmaker, and it is clear when they say it that they mean it. This is not the simple or comfortable part of the Mitchell family's story. It is the most human part. Because people are not one thing. Mothers are not one thing. The woman who buried the truth and the woman who made breakfast and the woman whose children love her despite everything she did and did not do. Those are all the same woman. And the Mitchell children are the ones who have to live with all of them at once, forever. George Mitchell was buried in a basement on Long Island for 55 years. The story told above his grave was that he had left. For children grew up inside that story. They built their identities inside it. They measured their own worth against it. Every relationship Jean ever tested. Every time Patricia held herself at a slight remove from someone who wanted to get close. Every time Stephen understood fatherhood as something conditional. Every time Michael reached for the shape where a father was supposed to be and found nothing there. All of it was the product of a lie told by one woman in a kitchen on a morning in 1963, delivered with the specific flat certainty of someone who had already decided that the truth was not going to be available to anyone else. The damage that lie did was real. The years it cost were real. The wound it made in 4 people was real and deep and lasting. And not one word of the premise on which it was built was true. Every family has a story it tells about itself. Most of those stories are true enough. Some of them are incomplete. And some of them, more than any of us should be entirely comfortable with, are constructed by someone with something to protect and delivered to the children who inherit them with the authority of fact and absorbed by those children as truths about themselves rather than lies about the person telling them. The Mitchell children did not spend 55 years being lied to about their father. They spent 55 years being lied to about themselves, about their value, about what they deserved, about the fundamental question of whether the people who were supposed to love them unconditionally actually did. That is what a buried truth does to the people living above it. It does not stay buried. It rises. It enters the bodies and the beliefs of the people in the house above it. And it works its damage silently, below the level of the visible, for as long as it is allowed to remain underground. Michael Mitchell picked up a shovel. That is the center of this story. Not the dramatic discovery, not the forensic confirmation, not the military honors at the National Cemetery, though all of those things matter enormously. The center of this story is a man who spent his entire life feeling the shape of an absence he could not name, who bought the house where the absence lived and stayed in it for 25 years circling the thing he could not see, who suffered a stroke and handed his sons his tools and trusted them to keep going. The center of this story is the belief that the truth was down there and that it mattered enough to dig for. Most buried truths do not require a jackhammer and 6 feet of compacted earth. Most of them require something considerably simpler. A conversation that nobody has started yet, a question that has been sitting in a family for years without anyone daring to ask it, a story that has been passed down through a generation with a seam in it that everyone has felt and nobody has pressed. So here is what I am asking you to take from the Mitchell family story. Think about the narratives your own family carries. The explanations you were given in childhood about the people who left or failed or disappeared without satisfying explanation. Are you completely certain those explanations are the whole truth? Not all of them will be false. Most of them probably are not. But some of them may have a seam in them, a place where the version you were given does not quite account for all the available evidence. where someone shut down a particular line of inquiry with more force than the question seemed to warrant, where the story has always felt, at some level you have never fully examined, like it was built to withstand pressure rather than simply to tell the truth. If you have a story like that in your family, it might be worth asking what is on the other side of it. Not because there is necessarily a body in a basement, but because the Mitchell children spent 55 years carrying something that was never real. And the cost of that carrying was a real and measurable thing. And it did not have to be. If this story moved you, please share it with one person who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Tales of Human Shadows so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a story in your own family that turned out not to be the whole truth? The Mitchell family spent 55 years thinking they were alone in theirs. They were not. Nobody who carries a family secret ever truly is. George Mitchell spent 55 years in a basement on Long Island. His name was George Raymond Mitchell. He deserved better, and his children deserve the truth. This has been Tales of Human Shadows. Every shadow has a story. This is where they live.